Hi, everybody. This is Corey Jenks and the team here. Thank you for joining us. I think we talked about this meeting a few times in our kickoff last week. And really the goal of this meeting is to start to get everyone intimately familiar with the file spec. And this is the specifications for providing the transaction data from your systems to the Open Checkbook, which we'll be doing in the onboarding environment for now, and then eventually once live, these files will be going to production. So this is the start of that discussion. I know, I think we only have just about an hour or so, and there's a lot of material. So whatever we don't get through, we will do follow-ups with, either to schedule something else or have other conversations with people. But really, this is your chance to start to see some of the explanations of the detail so that you can start formulating your questions and start the work that needs to happen. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff and Ben that'll go over kind of the agenda and the file specs and walk us through it. Throughout the entire process, of course, ask questions as you have them, and we'll try to address everything, and what we can't address, we'll take down and follow up with afterwards.
Great. Thank you, Corey. So this is Jeff. The primary goal, again, for today's session, again, as Corey mentioned, is to really review the details of the file specification document, and then if we get through that, then we'd like to also review with you the file transmission process. So jumping right in, does everyone have a copy of the file specification spreadsheet? It was just sent? Okay. We may want to give you a minute to receive that. But essentially, when you open up the spreadsheet, it's broken up into, we're going to cover 3 key tabs. The first tab highlights a lot of the business requirements. We're not going to hit every single one of those, but there's definitely a few highlighted that we want to make sure we cover with the group. And then we'll walk through the payments and payroll fields in detail. And so I guess I'll go ahead and just pass it off to Ben.
Email that came through?
So that would have just come from Bobby Weinstein. It just came through probably a couple of minutes ago. You guys do have an older version, but we wanted to send you the updated one that we'll be reviewing today. So let us know if that makes it through. It should have a copy of this presentation as well.
Check your email. Well, why don't I check that?
You'll be able to see the file on this screen, but it'll definitely be more helpful to have it locally once it arrives.
Here's if you guys are looking on the screen, excuse me, if you're looking on the screen right now, you should be able to see the sample, basically the file spec that we sent over.
So Ben, do you want to go ahead and start walking through the high-level business requirements?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks everyone for joining. I know for some of the folks on the call, the file spec is a bit of review. I believe we've gone through some of the stuff with the mass development folks a few months back. Some of the other folks on the line may also have not seen some of this. So hopefully some of it's review for some of you guys, and for other people, that'll be new kind of content here. So if you take a look at the document, at the bottom there's a bunch of tabs. The first tab we're actually going to kind of come back to later, and that tab actually highlights the high-level specifications of kind of what's the processing, what are our standards, how does this happen over kind of a month-to-month versus historical, what's involved with categorizations and some of those types of things. But before we get into that, we wanted to highlight for you guys the individual data elements that are required. And so that helps kind of the authorities start to think about the exact requirements from a data perspective as far as what you guys need to start building to get the data out of your systems and kind of into our systems. So, and we've kind of organized these different data elements across the tabs at the bottom. You'll notice how I'll click on the Payment Specs tab. And maybe I'll pause there. Does that kind of approach make sense to folks as far as kind of where that fits in the ecosphere of the task that we've talked about and kind of next steps? Okay. Cool. So if you look at the first tab here, this is the Payments tab. Across the top, there's a couple of different fields up here. The first is the field name, description of the field, what that field type is. So for the IT guys in the room, this will be, if it's a variable character field or if it's a text field or a date, things like that. Maximum field length, whether it's nullable or not, and then some examples that we pulled out that when we've gone through the process in the past, what the actual examples are for this field. And then actually, after I go through the data, I guess, requirements here, there's another tab at the bottom that I believe has some sample data in it, and this will help kind of hoping to help you guys visualize how the data is going to look when it comes out of the system. So the first field we'll walk through here is pretty simple. This would be the authority code. This is a consistent static identifier for each authority. And typically in the past, we've worked with authorities to define, like, usually it's like a 4 or 5 digit code that we use kind of in the system to maintain uniqueness across authorities, among a variety of other reasons that we have it. And so, for example, with MBTA, that we just use their 4-digit MBTA code for this field. The authority name, so this would be the name of the authority. I would assume that should be pretty straightforward. The authority fiscal year. So this is the fiscal year associated with the payment transaction, and that should be fairly straightforward. Note that, and then below that is the fiscal period. And in the past, we've actually had where the fiscal year and the fiscal period may not match up with the actual authority payment date. So just kind of tying rows 3, 4, and 5 together. If for accounting reasons you may have had a payment date that got cut during a certain time period, but it's associated with a fiscal period for accounting purposes, those periods can be separate. So you may have transactions that went out January 1st, but they may be associated with the fiscal period outside of that month. So a quick thing to highlight there around the timing of the payment, and just relative to the things we've kind of gone through in the past. Another thing to note for those first 5 fields, we really look to get that information as required from authorities, and this really gets back into kind of being able to tell enough of a complete story around the payments or the data that's required when we put this on Open Checkbook. So that's kind of highlighted in column I there with the not null fields. Going down the line, so let me pause there. Is there any questions on the first handful of fields?
So the not nullable means that it's a required field. It has to have a piece of data in it.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And this might be obvious, but for every transaction that is sent to the Open Checkbook, all of these fields are required. So every transaction will say MBTA, Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, and then the fiscal year all the way across. So you are repeating data for every transaction, but that's the way that it's ingested. You'll see how it's illustrated in the sample file in a second.
And an example that we typically have in the state for the difference between the fiscal year payment period and payment date is after the fiscal year closes in June, we continue to have payments against that fiscal year into July and August, September, and even October. So the payment dates on those would be September, but the fiscal year and period would be the prior fiscal year and the period that they should apply to from an accounting perspective.
And most of the pages on the Open Checkbook are geared more towards the accounting period as opposed to the actual date that the check was cut. Thinking things like, line charts, and you would typically filter a lot of the pages by fiscal year anyways. So it tends to lend itself more to the accounting side of the process when we talk about the way that the data is visualized on the screens. So moving on to the next few fields, we have funding type name and funding type code. So sample state examples of these would be like operating or capital trust for funding types. The funding type code, typically there is a code associated with it. The state uses, I believe, a 3-character field to assign for its funding types, but obviously, each authority, we understand that the authorities vary in kind of size and complexity. So this is kind of whatever your internal accounting systems use to capture these fields is appropriate if it is applicable. Going down to accounts. So again, we try to put some state examples of accounts in here. They also may be called appropriations. And these are the accounts that are typically sourced in the accounting system. Again, we give the availability to have both an account number and an account name. So examples of the state for an estate account would be MBTA state, or I guess we left an authority example on this one, would be MBTA state and local contributions payment. So, and again, when we send out the sample data, or I believe some of you may have the sample data, you'll see some examples of sample accounts that other authorities have used. Going down to departments. So a quick few notes on departments. We do provide the flexibility for you guys to send us both department codes and department name. We only require the department name because we understand that some authorities may not track particular department codes. And for authorities that don't have full organization, well, there's actually kind of two things going on. So for kind of big authority organizations that have multiple levels within their organization, we're asking that those authorities kind of flatten their organizational hierarchy into a flat set of departments that we can track against. And conversely, for authorities that don't have a lot of departments associated with them, we ask that you default just your authority name to that department. So two examples of that in the past that we've used when we worked at MBTA, they had a full organizational structure, and they flattened their structure down to just a list of standard departments. And conversely, with MSBA, they didn't have any departments because they were a smaller authority, and so they just provided a default of MSBA. So a few notes on the department structure there.
So really, though, when you say flatten, really all you're saying is just provide the department you want that transaction to be tied to, right?
That's right. And if there are multiple tiers within the organizational structure, you just would pick the most appropriate level that those transactions are getting tied to. Questions on those few fields that we went through?
And again, just a note, the fund and the account, depending on what you want to provide, we have the ability to ingest that information, but it's something you may want to look at providing if it best tells the story of your business. But again, those are optional details.
Great. So moving on to spending categories and subcategories. The spending category information is a high-level list. So this has been kind of a hot topic. We've gone through this in the past, but this is the, as we've gone through kind of the onboarding materials and process, this is the high-level set of spending categories that we're asking authorities to attempt to try and conform to. So I believe it's a list of 11 that we're targeting. Obviously, we'll work with authorities if there are anomalies or adjustments that need to be made to that mapping. But basically, it's a high-level categorization of all the payments data that goes out the door for your authority. And that particular field, for the spending category field, we do try and standardize along those lines of 11 categories. And alternatively, the spending subcategories code and name, those can be defined within the authority. So this allows a little bit of flexibility to have authorities be able to categorize their data at the base level and say, whatever accounting system is used, you can use, I think some used object codes and object classes if you follow that structure. I believe MSBA did that. Or if you have your own kind of set of spending subcategories that are appropriate within the context of your business, those can be defined within the authority. So two things to note there: the spending subcategories are authority defined, whereas the roll-up to the spending categories, which are their parent level, those are defined. We target authorities to define those in the 11 that are kind of targeted within the state.
Yeah. So an example of some of those 11 are like administrative expenses, consultant services, equipment lease and purchase, information technology, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be your category. And then an example of a subcategory would be, say, you go to administrative expenses, and then office supplies would be the subcategory. So the assumption there is that the systems that you're tracking your payments in also track, I guess, what you're spending the money on by some sort of category.
So is that a required field?
It is, and we understand that likely for most of you guys, it's not something that's currently tracked. Within categories. So we totally understand that it's a bit of a lift to go through and categorize that, but a large majority of the Open Checkbook pages for browsing and kind of filtering purposes run off of a set of kind of categories to keep things simple for users to be able to kind of disseminate lots of information. And so that's why we have listed it as kind of targeted as a required field.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
And we'll come back to this a little bit. We have a couple slides on spending categorization that we'll go over again.
Yeah. Any other questions on the spending category? To Corey's point, we will, kind of dive into this topic a bit more in detail a little bit later. Okay, cool. So we will move down to, some of the rest, or a lot of the rest of these fields are, at least the next kind of 5 or 6 fields are all very related. And so what we've done here is, this is starting with row 15, this would be your recipient. So this is the recipient of your payment that went out the door. And this is typically just a code if you guys have if you have a recipient code, this would be that. So this is like similar to like a vendor. If you have a vendor code, someone who did work for your authority, that would be what you would put in that field. Recipient name, pretty straightforward. This would be the legal name of the recipient as provided in their documentation. And ideally we would have both a code and a name, but we have, in default we can use the recipient name as needed. And there actually are some cases where your payments may not have recipients. These are things like bulk transactions or vendorless payments that go out the door for various reasons that don't necessarily have a true recipient. And we can talk about the structure and content of those later. Some may have a recipient alias, so we left that field there as well. And this would be like the name of the recipient, who's doing business as, if that a field like that is provided. Moving down to the next set of fields, we have headquartered in city, state, and zip, and remit to city, state, and zip. So the distinction here between these fields is that if there's a difference between where your checks are actually being sent to versus the actual physical location of that recipient, we've allowed the authorities to provide that information in both places. So we ran into a situation in the past where checks were going out the door to say a P.O. box or something like that, whereas they wanted to provide the actual appropriate or official recipient office headquarters, for example. So that's the difference. You want to highlight that?
Yeah, so on the open checkbook, if you spend some time on it, you realize we actually don't show any addresses on the open checkbook. So this information will not be displayed, but under the advanced search, we do have the capability to search for payments to vendors headquartered in certain cities or towns or states. So it allows the user to do a little bit of a geographical search up, let me see all the vendors headquartered in my state that are getting paid, but we do not show addresses.
Questions on that distinction or any of the recipient content? Okay, so moving on to row number 24. This is the export date. So this is the data the transactional information would be exported from your system. This is important from an auditing perspective, not a true audit, but for us to kind of maintain uniqueness across data files within the data and kind of understand, what the data is valid as of. And so that's what that field is meant to capture. So this would be, you guys have gone through and all of your transactions have gone through, and now you've exported a file and sent it over to the open checkbook. This would be the day that information was exported out of your system. And again, it's for us to, if there are issues or if there's things we need to kind of remediate on, it helps maintain, kind of the last state of affairs of when that data came out of the system. The next field is a payment ID. So this is really kind of used as a catch-all field if the authority can provide it. It's great for testing purposes. It's great for, again, kind of auditing purposes if there are any discrepancies to have a payment ID because, we can use the unique combination of the other fields in the file if we need to, but having the payment ID is a nice catch-all. I believe with MBTA we use payment ID to make sure, hey, can you check on this particular record for me? And then we would go and validate it without having to look at a unique combination of, on this date for this recipient, etc. The spending amount, that should be pretty straightforward. This is basically the payment or the payment dollar amount that left your authority. And so that should be pretty straightforward. The next is the recipient suppression flag. So this was kind of what I alluded to earlier around what the state defines as summary transactions. So in certain cases, the authority may not want to. The authority may be comfortable with sending a record, but only at the summary level. So maybe they want to show, hey, we've spent $1 million on, X, Y, and Z spending category, but we don't want to show, the particular recipients within that spending category for a variety of reasons. It could be security reasons. It could be that, they may just not track the actual vendor or the actual recipient. In any case, this flag will allow when the data is coming out of your system to flag out and let us know that we want to hide the recipient information for that particular record. Of course, we also ask that you would send a null recipient there, but it's kind of a catch-all to make sure that those records are shown in the right way, in the most appropriate way possible. So that's what the recipient suppression flag is for. Payment status is an important field that we use, and for the IT folks on the call, this is how we track if some of you folks are using PeopleSoft or if you're using other internal accounting systems. This tracks the basically workflow of the payment throughout the process. So in the past, say you had a payment that was paid and then it became voided or canceled, and then it became reissued. We want to make sure that we maintain the latest, most accurate value for that payment. And so the payment status helps maintain the uniqueness of the payment throughout that process. So essentially, we're trying to make sure that we're not assuming that a payment that went out the door this week for a previously voided overwrites a payment that was voided. Instead, we want to make sure that we kind of consolidate all of that history together and roll those values up to the most latest net value for that payment.
So an example of this would be if I did a payment of $2,000 for Department A on date January 1st, and then we realized that we needed to negate that payment because it was not a valid payment that went out, or it was a return or some business reason that payment came back. Then we would still provide that same department and category and payment date exactly as the previous transaction, but we changed the payment status so that it would be a unique record and provide a negative spending amount. And so in our system, if we saw those two records, one with a positive spending amount, one with a negative spending amount, and if they canceled out to zero, we would no longer show that payment on the dashboard. So we'll get down to it a little bit with actions, but this is a way of providing corrective information without having to reload all of your data.
Does that make sense to people, folks online? Questions on that? Okay. So the last two fields, well, I should say the second to last field is the spending type. So this field is actually another pretty important field that we've added as part of this new release. And so historically, we actually just tracked all the payments all the spending that went out the door for an authority or for the state as just spending like a regular payment. But for this, as we've kind of evolved the solution over time, we've actually added a spending type to this file to allow authorities to specify what type of spending that was. So the three primary types that the Open Checkbook supports are payments, which has been historically how we've captured that information. But we've also added loans and grants to this process. So again, this would allow you to specify whether it was payment, whether it was a loan transaction, whether it was a grant transaction that went out. We're still trying to capture all the money that's going out the door. This is just our way of categorizing, the different types of financial instruments that the authority might have. And this was kind of driven based on some feedback that we got while we were going through design with different authorities over the course of the last couple of years, that said, hey, we realize some authorities really have the bulk of their spending in loans form or in grants form as opposed to true payments. So again, trying to paint the full picture of what spending is for the authority, and that's what this field allows this payment or this file to do. And then the last piece is the action type. So this is kind of a catch-all field that we really use more for kind of auditing and testing purposes. but it actually just specifies whether it's an inserted record, an updated record, or a deleted record. Again, it's just kind of a catch-all if there's something that is not going, correctly with the rest of the file process. It allows us to maintain uniqueness there. So typically for the first phase of this project, and I believe for all authorities that we've worked with so far, we've just had them defaulted as inserts, and we've used other methods such as the payment status and to track kind of records through time and maintain consistency that way. Maybe I'll stop there. Any questions on the payments file spec? I know there's a lot of fields to go through, but hopefully you guys can spend some time and review the actual details of this tab of this file. Yep. And so we can kick this off into an example of the payments file spec. So if you click on the next tab here, you'll notice we've pulled in some sample data from MBTA. That kind of highlights how they kick their data out of the system and the general structure of what this would look like in an end case. And so you can see here how we've kind of gone through and in spreadsheet form displayed the authority code, which is the 4-digit code, MBTA's name, a fiscal year and period, a payment date, which you can see, actually I believe that one may match, a funding type name and code, accounts and appropriation information, department code and department name, so you can see how they have policing department, construction management, the different spending categories. So again, these are the categories that we have defined here in the state, and that we ask the authorities to target. The spending subcategory codes and subcategory names. So this would be, these subcategory codes and names that you're seeing here were actually defined by MBTA, and then they just mapped. So they basically said, oh, we realize that, or we believe that it's appropriate for us to map our travel and meal expense subcategory within our authority to the state-defined facility and operational costs, and so that's how they made that distinction. Recipient code. These ones have recipient codes. I don't know why we're not showing recipient names on here, but you could definitely have recipient names for these. Export date. So you'll see the export date on here that came out of their system. This is typically repeated as the same date for the full file, for a singular file, when that file was exported. Payment ID. So you'll notice here how they are kicking off an internal payment ID. And again, this is just very useful for us from a testing standpoint to be able to look up a particular record at a particular point in time.
That's also, that payment ID that they gave as an example does look kind of scary, but it's obviously whatever your system uses as a identifier for your different transactions.
Oh, and here you can see, so this is why you're seeing the no recipient name here, is that they've actually, for these particular transactions, they've had the recipient suppression flag as yes here.
Not showing this one.
So they're not showing the vendor or the recipient in this particular case. So a good example of kind of, hey, these are really more kind of summary transactions as opposed to the detailed data that we want to show at all the various levels of detail within the Open Checkbook. And then at the end here, you have your payment status. So these are pretty simple. These are all listed as P for paid. So there was no, in this particular case, there was no, kind of paid, voided, canceled process within the payment structure.
So, two quick things. One, Ben, when the file's provided and created, are the column headers also included, or are they taken out?
When the file is sent, we've actually designed it in a very kind of easy to use way for the authorities, and especially for us as the testing team, where we don't have the headers on the file. So when you send it over, you'll send it just with. We've displayed the headers here, so you can kind of see what's going on. But when you send the final file, you won't have headers on the file.
Yeah, so it's just the data. And then secondly, this might be obvious, but just to point out, the order of the fields in the spreadsheet is important. So when we receive the data, we need to receive, for example, the authority code is the first field that has to be on the far left. So just keep that in mind.
That's even if they're blank, correct? You still you need to have blanks as well.
Yep. So every field is delimited by a pipe. We can talk about that very soon, but the order of the fields absolutely matters.
Any questions on that stuff? The sample data, the ordering, the general data we've kind of talked through. Okay. So if there's no questions, we can go ahead and move on to the payroll data. If you click on the next tab here, the payroll data is I would say significantly simpler than the payments data. It follows a bit of a different structure, but it has the same kind of general tab structure here. So we'll talk through those fields. In the Open Checkbook screens, I would say probably 80 to 90% of the screens really display the payments data, and we have one kind of main dashboard for payroll. However, we do get a lot of volume of folks on the payroll page, so it is definitely data that gets a fair amount of visibility when it comes to the kind of overall structure of the site. And so these are the payroll fields that we're asking authorities to push through. The first would be the recipient, or I guess this would be the employee code, or excuse me, the recipient code. So this would be a consistent static code for each, I guess in this case, agency. So again, this would be MBTA. The recipient name, so this would be, again, your recipient name associated with the authority, essentially your authority name. The calendar year, so payroll runs off of an actual calendar year cycle as opposed to the fiscal year cycle. And so this is the calendar year associated with the recipient's payroll record. This may or may not match the year the payroll end date falls into. So again, depending on the way that your payroll system works, you may or may not have the actual payroll date be associated within the same year as the calendar year. The payroll date as of, so this is a fairly important field. This, we understand that kind of each authority has different payroll cycles that they go through. Some do biweekly, some have kind of end month processes that run for payroll. And so this end date actually, or this payroll date as of, it basically lists out what the last payroll cycle that you guys have gone through is. And in general, we'll talk through this in a minute. The payroll cycle, we're not asking authorities to go through and send us files for every payroll cycle. We're actually asking authorities to kind of send us a full bulk payroll file that increments every month, and you guys just attach on the latest month's payroll and resend the full file. So this payroll date as of, again, kind of says, hey, here's what that file is as of. So that's the payroll date as of. The employee ID is the employee's unique identification number. Let's see, unique number. So what this is this. We understand that for authorities, some may not be able to provide the actual internal employee's unique identification number, like the one that the system would track. But we do ask that authorities provide us some semblance of unique identification number for an employee. This helps us maintain uniqueness in the system. And again, it doesn't need to mean anything from a business standpoint. It's just something that we would use internally to track and maintain uniqueness of the employees.
Yeah, because there's a lot of names that you'd be surprised how many people have the exact same names, especially with fathers and sons working for the state, for example. So This is a way we don't double count.
We actually had a father, I think it was a father and son with the same name who worked in the same department, and they ended up doubling their employee payroll.
Same job title, too.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it, but it happens. So that's the employee ID. The employee last name and first name and middle name, pretty straightforward. Again, these are, aside from the middle name, these are required fields. The employee job title. So this is the employee's current job title and as of the active period that you're sending the data in. And again, this may be shared by multiple employees, so you can reuse whatever it is, social worker, professor, across. These can be standardized job title names. The employee job code. So this is also maybe listed as the position identifier. This is a unique identifier of the employee's job. So again, you could use. We don't really display the job code on any of the dashboard screens, but again, it's good to help us maintain uniqueness for the actual job title. So we do ask that if there is an internal employee job code associated with your internal system, that the authority provides that. Going down to department code and department name, these would be the same structure and likely similar department codes and names as departments you provide associated with the payments transactions. However, they're not required to be the same, so you may have different departments associated with payroll that are not valid departments associated with payments. So we have the flexibility to handle and maintain them separately. But again, they follow the same process where department code is not required, department name is required, and again, it's the employee's currently assigned department name as part of that record. Payroll amount. This is the cumulative payroll earnings for a calendar year, and for the current year, this represents a year-to-date value. So this gets back into the general structure of the file, and the reason why, so the payroll file, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next section, is actually a kind of a running sum of payroll within the same file. So we maintain for a given year, we will maintain for a given year, for a given employee, per job, per department, they will get a cumulative payroll value. For historical years, this represents the full payroll that they were paid as a cumulative sum of all of their individual payroll cycles. For the current year, it represents the summation of all the payroll they've received to date. So, for example, you would send in the file, one file that contains the data starting in, I believe we're going back to calendar year 2010, through the current date, maintained across years, across departments and job codes. So within the historical files, when we sum all this data up, you would get a summation of the payroll for that year, and then for the current year, you would get the summation of payroll to date. In addition, for the current year, we're also asking for a salary. And this is the kind of listed salary that would be as part of typically like an HR system. It does not represent the aggregation of all the individual payroll cycles. It represents typically the stated salary for that employee. We only display salaries for the current year, and so typically we ask authorities to only export salaries for the current year. If you do export, if that's technically a challenge, we do check to clear out prior year salaries, largely because as people progress through their careers, we want to make sure that we're only displaying the most accurate salary for the current year.
So for historical data, are they sending a payroll file for 2010, a separate payroll file for 2011, or is it one historical file?
It's one full file that we are asking from authorities from beginning to end. And the reason we do it this way is because there's no real way for us to maintain consistency of an employee across files. It's tough because we don't want to maintain your internal employee identifiers for security reasons and basically for security reasons. And so because of that, and also because payroll data is typically a lower volume than the payments data, we're asking authorities to kind of maintain one master file that they just add to as we go forward in time. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so this is a very important distinction between the payments and the payroll. So with payments, you'll provide a yearly file of historical data per year, and then you'll provide increments, and we will just add on in our system. But for payroll, because if there's any sort of corrections that need to be made, we typically just wipe out the entire payroll data that you have for your authority, and then just reload it from your updated file, which in your updated file would basically have your history to date since 2010.
And this is fairly aggregated data again, so we're not asking for the individual, weekly cycles of payroll from 2010 forward. We're asking for yearly level payroll that's aggregated for a year for an employee, for a job title and a department, all within one file. But typically the file volumes are fairly low relative to payments, so that's why we maintain it this way. Questions on the payroll data?
So again, if I look at a payroll file since 2010, I'll have 4 records for myself. So I'll have my 2010 salary, my 2010 annual pay. I'll have my 2011, 2012, 2013.
That's right, unless you did something like switch job titles within a year or switch departments within a year. Okay.
Then you have your 2014 to date.
Yes.
Okay. Yep. So we do maintain some level of detail with payroll, but we do understand that everyone has different cycles internally within their payroll systems. So we try and display it at a bit of a more aggregate level. So there's no questions on payroll. I'll go ahead and highlight some sample MBTA payroll data. So if you click on the next tab, you'll see here how we're displaying essentially kind of the level of detail that we just kind of described. So you'll see here how we have a recipient code, a recipient name, which is really your authority code and authority name, which is MBTA for the code, and Massachusetts Bay Transport Authority for the name. Calendar year, the payroll date as of, so it looks like this when this imported into Excel, it had a funky formatting, but this would basically be a date field that is as of, so it would look similar to the, well, maybe those got swapped. In any event, this would be the payroll date as of would be the actual date field that came out of your system. Employee ID, this is typically a number that, we talked about is just basically like an internal code for your employee. But again, we don't want the actual internal code. We would rather you send us some sort of, just unique identifier. Employee last name, employee first name, middle name, job title. So you see here how we have, for MBTA, they had job titles as well as job codes. Department codes and department names. Again, for MBTA, they had both a department code and a department name. And then the payroll amount versus the salary, which is the annual rate. So you'll notice here how these values may differ if, for example, you got someone worked a lot of overtime, or they, for various reasons, they took time off or whatever it may be. Their payroll amount may be more or less than their actual annual listed salary rate, and you'll see that here. So in our first example here, we have a payroll amount that's higher than our salary rate, and I believe, actually, it looks like all these are higher. So a quick note on that. And then again, the export date would be the export date that it came actually out of your system. So an important distinction here between the export date and the payroll date as of. So for the payroll date as of, this is what you are defining as of basically what the data within the file is as of internally within your payroll cycles, versus the export date, which is the actual date that the file is exported. So if there was a week delay between when the file was created and finished and reviewed versus when it was actually exported out of the system, you may see a difference in the export date versus the payroll data as of. And we actually display the payroll data as of on the dashboard screens so that users understand when they do see certain values in the system, what they're as of. And so that's an important distinction between the difference between the export date and the payroll date as of. Questions on that? Any questions on that part of the process?
Since a lot of people right now aren't starting out with pensions, we're not going to spend the time going over the pensions fields. But if you take a look at them and you have any questions, obviously reach out to us.
So we have about 13 minutes left. Do we want to hit the high-level specifications or go back to the deck?
And on that note, if we have any extra time, we can go over a little bit. And if anyone needs to drop off, that's fine. This is recording, so if we need an extra couple minutes to finish, that would probably be better.
So let's switch back to the deck and go over some of the high-level pieces that we have, and then, time permitting, we can go back and review some of the requirements in that first tab. But if people need to drop off, please read those. They cover a lot of what we talked about as we went through the fields, and come back to us with questions.
Okay. All right, so Ben has walked through the file specification document. So again, looking at this, at the next slide, a couple key points on this. Some systems, some authorities, when they create the files, they either programmatically do it or they can manually do it. So MBTA, for example, they wrote an integration program that just exports the data to a flat file that meets our specification, and then they just send it over to us. But Prem and MSBA, they actually export the data to a spreadsheet, and then they convert that data in Excel to a pipe delimited file and then send that to us. So there's different ways to get the data out of the systems depending on the complexity of the system and the type of system, but just want to make it clear that for authorities that need to export things into Excel, there's a way that you can convert that easily into a pipe delimited file. Any questions on that? Okay. All right, and then in terms of the file transmission process, as I mentioned earlier, there's two different ways that authorities have been exporting the information. But once you have it in that file, one thing to note is the file should be named to a very specific format, and that format is dictated in the file specification. I can talk about that in a second. But essentially, once you have the file, you'll drop that file onto ANF or the state's interchange architecture, and all that is basically just you'll use a secure file transfer copy tool or utility just to move the file onto interchange, and then from there they have a set of facilities that will basically scan the file, make sure it's safe, and then route that file directly to our servers. Does anyone have any questions on the client that's used to send the data over? Interchange requires it to be secure FTP over port 22. Typical tools that folks use are either WinSCP or FileZilla, or you can automate it if you want to do that. Any questions? Okay. There we go. All right, now in terms of the transmission frequency, according to the statute, files should be provided every 30 days. The solution supports providing files or receiving files even at much more frequent intervals. But as we work with you, if it makes sense for your information to be provided at a different frequency, so say quarterly, then we can definitely talk through that and figure out what works best for the agency.
So a little bit more information about that you'll see in the business rules is that basically you can send your file anytime. So say you have maybe say you do send your file monthly, you can send it to Interchange via the SFTP client any day. And we have a monthly process that will pick it up at the end of the month and load it in. So you can drop the file anytime, but you won't see it reflected into the Open Checkbook until after that monthly process runs at the end of the month.
And there's typically, if you look at the information in Open Checkbook, there's typically a month to 2 months lag, just because you'll need time to, say, review your data before you send it over if you want to, and then obviously when it lands on our server, we process it at the end of the month, or actually at the beginning of the month. Again, we mentioned earlier, it'd be great if information could be provided back to 2010, but obviously if you don't have information dating back to that date, then let us know and we can work to figure out what'll be best for you. We do have the ability to delete information. Ben may have alluded to this earlier in the file spec, but if for any reason you send over a sensitive piece of information and it needs to be redacted, we have the ability on our end. Unfortunately, it's not in the slide, but we have the ability on our end to remove that from the system immediately. So you would send us a note to the support team here indicating which transaction or groups of transactions that need to be removed from the system, and we'll do so. And then that gives you time to send us a corrected data file that we can then load back into the system and have it corrected forever. Any questions on redaction?
So as you can see, as we talked about some of this, there's various ways we have to correct information. In the payments file spec, you saw the payment status so that you could send multiple payments onto payment status, and we would aggregate the values. So if you could negate out a payment, and it would then no longer show on the Open Checkbook. Through the portal, you have the ability to delete transactions associated with a file that you sent. So if you sent a file last month and you realize you wanted to make some wholesale corrections to that data, you can go and delete all the transactions associated with that file and then send a new file to be uploaded And then you can see here that we support deleting an entire fiscal year. So say at the end of your fiscal year, you do a whole bunch of corrections to your payments data, and you don't want to send 300 negative or adjusting transactions. You can delete the entire fiscal year's worth of data from Open Checkbook, and you can send a new file which represents all the fiscal year's transactions corrected. So our goal here is to give you, various ways to update your data so that it's fresh, up to date, and accurate based on how you want it to show in the Open Checkbook.
Great, thank you. All right, now going back to essentially this diagram, the interchange process itself. There is an interchange team within the Commonwealth that will work with you to make sure that you get connectivity or that you connect successfully. We'll provide you a guide that basically just stipulates how you would connect to our system or to the interchange system, and you'll also be provided credentials by the interchange team. So each authority will have their own set of credentials to log into interchange provide files. And the reason we do this is so that authorities cannot access or see other authorities' data. So it's a level of security that we put in place. So again, at the time that at the time of onboarding, you'll work directly with that team to make sure that you can connect. So you'll send over a few test files, make sure you're good to go, and then from that point forward, you should be able to upload your files as necessary. We already touched on the different utilities you could use from your end, but it doesn't matter what utility, it just needs to be a secure file transfer protocol, and we use port 22. So you may have to open that up on your side. Let's see, what else do we have here? The other key piece of information is the naming structure. So oddly enough, we did incur some challenges with folks just adhering to the naming structure, but just be keen to that because a lot of the processing on our side depends on the actual structure, especially the quasi, the agency name, and the type. These three pieces of information are used by the program itself to basically route and process your data. The third bullet, and Corey mentioned this earlier, you can drop your files onto our system at any point, but they will not be processed when you drop them immediately. This especially is true for production. So if you drop your files in the middle of the month, you may have to wait 2 weeks until they process. When they do process, you will receive a confirmation email that'll basically say what file was processed, and then it'll actually also give you a record count. So if you need to do just a quick check on your side, you can reconcile some of the counts.
In our onboarding environment, how frequently do we process files dropped?
So for the onboarding environment, they'll be processed at a much more frequent basis. So I think on our side, we're still figuring out whether that's going to be X number of times per day or daily, but it'll most likely be something like at least hourly. Mm-hmm. So that way you can provide information and immediately see the results. So more to come. We'll definitely have that ironed out. Okay. So moving on to the spending categories. A lot of this we've already drained, but the key message here is the state already has, say, 11 generic spending categories. They pretty much do. We feel they're fairly general enough to capture most of the spending, despite your organization. So if you can make an effort to map to these high-level spending categories, that would be great. Obviously, there's some categories that you do not need, so you don't need to use those. And there's some categories that may be unique to your organization that you may want to add. So the system has the flexibility to do that, to add those in, and you can tie your spending accordingly. I would say that you want to start you may want to have your business folks start looking at how you want to categorize your information. It's not a complex process, but we found that it typically requires conversation between different business folks on how you want to have it represented on the Open Checkbook. So The next slide, this just gives more detail or definition around those spending categories. And then lastly, in terms of best practices review, we'll continue to meet with you on a regular basis and share with you some more of the best practices and lessons learned as we go through the process together. But just from a high level, I mean, I can't reemphasize enough that it's important for the business folks to really start to think about the spending categories and the sensitivity of the information. And what I mean by that is start to think about what information you don't want to provide the open checkbook. So whatever you send, whatever you put in that file and send to us, that's what's going onto the open checkbook. So we're not doing any filtering for data on our side. It's going to be the responsibility of the authority to filter out that information. But again, these exercises do take time. I think what was important for us is we had regular meetings we had what's called a working group and also an executive committee, and just had the people in the room just discuss, like, what do we think is sensitive? What do you think what are the items that we definitely do not want to display to the public? And an example of that is we don't want to display transactions that have anything to do with a victim of violent crime. Or for witness protection programs, we don't want to provide those types of transactions because then you can find out what hotels people are staying in. But I think what was absolutely key is getting the people in the room to talk about it and brainstorm and pull together those ideas and all in one forum. So, any questions on that? There's obviously a lot. Oh, go ahead.
Quick question with regards to your spending categories, if you go back like one or two slides. So in this case, where would, personnel support? I understand salaries are going in under a different category or under a different grouping, but what about personnel support?
What do you mean by personnel?
Let's just say healthcare or other benefits and things of that nature, or taxes.
So for you're talking about benefits that a employee receives?
Right.
I go ahead.
Would
So
that all be categorized into the salary, or that's not how I understood it?
So that is in somewhat a business decision, up to you. I mean, I do not believe the state in their salaries, conveys. I believe, from a gross salary perspective, those.
All of it can be considered compensation, but my impression was that obviously payroll taxes isn't compensation.
Correct. So, the money you spend on that could be categorized in your payment categories. We're not showing a category for that here, but
So we can adjust these categories to what suits us. Yeah.
That's correct. So the goal of the categories here is for these categories at the top level that make sense and apply to your organization. Try to leverage them so that we at least have consistent terminology at one level. But this doesn't mean that you're constrained to these categories. You can develop your own and additional ones and put them here.
Okay.
That's a good question. Okay. All right. Any other questions before we move to close? So I think in terms of the Wave 1 schedule, this is just a snapshot of the overall timeline. I believe we already scheduled the individual data meetings, or are we in the process?
I don't believe so. We're in the process of it.
Okay.
So as you can see here on the timeline, this was kind of the key meeting to the file specs meeting to allow you to have the information you need to start beginning your context definition and development of your extracts files. So you see the 2 yellow stars there, which is beginning to develop contextual information, starting your category mapping. These are things that you should really be starting right away, so that as we work through issues, we have time to discuss them, address them, and help you through the process. Next week, we're going to be having a more detailed walkthrough of the configuration portal than we did in the demo during the kickoff. So that like this meeting will give you, a very detailed walkthrough of each field that you can adjust through the configuration portal. And then the week for it's not shown here, but we plan to have a longer meeting one-on-one with each of you to basically go over the information you have so far and answer questions now that you've seen the specs, you've maybe seen the portal, and are starting to do some of your own implementation, what questions you have, and that this session we could be able to go over that in detail. We can revisit any of the concepts that we talked about today as you see that they apply to you and work through some of the challenges that you're having. So that'll be the week after next.
And that's typically a very engaging meeting. So definitely have your IT folks present, and definitely have someone that represents your payroll business and your payments business.
And I know Bobby is working with all of you to schedule those meetings.
Okay. And and speaking of these meetings, as Corey just alluded to, the next slide outlines the upcoming agenda. Okay. Any other last minute questions? I believe as we move forward, our point of contact, or your point of contact for us, is Bobby. So I believe he's already been in contact with you and moving these things forward. So please continue to use him for any sort of questions, and he'll route to us or appropriately to get you your answers as soon as possible. Definitely, there's no bad question to ask. So whatever you need, we're here to support you by all means. So definitely use us.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We really appreciate
Thanks,
it. And I'm sure we'll talk to you offline as well. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Good. Cool.
Again.